The day had started like most others, beneath the low haze of dawn slipping between crumbling apartment blocks and alleyways that always smelled of something old. He had woken not from sleep, but from the heaviness of habit, from a back aching after hours curled on concrete, from hunger gnawing at his ribs like a forgotten drumbeat. The city was already moving, engines grumbling, doors slamming, steam rising from sewer grates like exhaled breath. He stood up, brushed off the dust that clung to his jeans, and slung the worn backpack over his shoulder. There was no destination, just direction. He walked past shuttered storefronts and early risers unlocking their gates. A fruit vendor gave him a look, half suspicion, half pity. He nodded politely, as he always did, and moved on. The sidewalks became cleaner as he reached the wealthier end of the city. Buildings glassed over with reflection. People in pressed coats holding coffee cups that cost more than meals. He'd stopped trying to blend in long ago. The restaurant was new. He hadn't seen it last month, which meant it was expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows, metal fixtures that shone like teeth, tables set even when empty. The name outside was in script, gold-leafed and vague, the kind of name that meant nothing but cost everything. He stood across the street at first, watching. Inside, people laughed with their mouths open wide, confident. Waiters moved like dancers, trays balanced with silent elegance. He didn't plan to go in. But the smell. It drifted across the street and wrapped around him, warm rosemary, sizzling garlic, butter. It had been 2 days since he last ate anything solid. The food bank had closed early. The shelter had only served soup and a heel of bread. His stomach pulled him forward like a tide. He crossed the street without thinking, the sidewalk beneath his feet almost soft with the weight of what he was walking toward. Inside, the air changed. Cooler, conditioned. It wrapped around his shoulders and pressed the outside world away. The maitre d' looked up, eyes catching first on the clothes, then the shoes, then the man inside them. There was a pause. Barely a second. But enough. A flicker of doubt turned to judgment. The man said nothing. He merely pointed toward the window seat, a quiet corner where light pooled on the tabletop. The server approached instead, tall and well-groomed, his apron folded sharp, a tablet gripped like a blade. He didn't ask what the man wanted. He asked if he had a reservation. The man said no. The server looked toward the hostess stand. The maitre d' raised an eyebrow but did not interfere. The server leaned closer. "This food isn't for beggars." He said it flat, soft, polished like something he had practiced. Not angry. Just dismissive. Like protocol. Around them, the air shifted. Utensils froze midair. Eyes lifted behind menus. A couple at the bar whispered behind their wine glasses. The man did not react. His face remained calm, unreadable. He looked past the server toward the window, toward the street where he had stood only moments ago. Then he met the server's eyes. Not defiance. Not shame. Just something still. Something unshaken. He nodded once and turned as if to leave. A few people snickered. The sound trailed after him as he passed by the gleaming silver of chairs, the polished black of tile floors, the sharp edges of wealth not made for him. He stepped back onto the sidewalk and stood beneath the awning, the smell still clinging to his coat. He reached into the side pocket of his backpack and pulled out a card. Plain. Unmarked. Black. He turned it over in his hand once, then slid it into his wallet. Then he walked away. But not far. Down the block was a small cafe. He stepped inside, ordered coffee black, no sugar, and waited. He pulled his phone from the same pocket as the card. Scrolled through contacts. Selected one. The restaurant belonged to his holding company. Acquired quietly in a recent buyout, still operating under the illusion of its former independence. The staff hadn't been updated yet. The books hadn't been touched. That would change. He made the call. Gave clear instructions. And returned to the restaurant. This time, when he entered, the hostess stood stiff. The server who had spoken earlier had vanished. Another man approached, the general manager, face pale, steps fast, apologies forming like sweat on his upper lip. But the man didn't want apologies. He wanted receipts. And by the time the last dessert was served that day, every single table had been paid for. The host tried to offer a table. He declined. He didn't want to eat anymore. He just wanted to leave. But not before he saw the server again, standing in the corner, pale, stunned, lips twitching toward words that wouldn't come. The man met his eyes once, and then walked into the wind. The door swung shut behind him, separating the scent of money and rosemary from the chill of the street. He didn't look back. The city swallowed him again without hesitation, as if it had been waiting for him to return. His shoes, scuffed and silent, beat out a slow rhythm against the pavement. People passed him, phones in hand, heads low, thoughts elsewhere. No one knew what had just happened. No one knew that a man with dirt on his jeans and holes in his pockets had just left behind a building full of people dining on food they didn't have to pay for. He took the long way back. It wasn't really a direction, just movement. Alleys and boulevards, past open markets and shuttered kiosks, through a neighborhood where streetlights buzzed but didn't blink. The faces here were familiar: vendors sweeping steps, kids kicking cans into crumpled crates, someone sleeping against the warmth of a laundromat vent. No one asked questions here. He preferred that. He stopped at a corner bodega. Inside, the cashier greeted him by name. Not with a smile, but with recognition. He asked nothing, just handed the man a paper bag already prepared: water, protein bars, a sandwich, and batteries. The kind of survival order that said everything without saying anything. The man reached into his wallet, pulled out the black card again, and tapped it once against the reader. No beep. No scan. Just a nod from the cashier, and then the bag was his. He left and sat outside on a plastic crate. The sandwich was cold but real. He ate slowly, chewing without hurry, watching the windows of the city glow awake as evening took its place. He sipped water, broke the protein bar into thirds, and ate only one. He didn't need more. Not yet. When the food was gone, he folded the bag and tucked it back into his coat. Waste had always felt like a kind of betrayal. Around the corner was a youth shelter he sometimes volunteered at. Quietly. He didn't use his name. Just a first one, the one he remembered best from before the rest of his life twisted upward. The shelter was just reopening for the night. A long line of teens and young adults waited outside, shoulders hunched, eyes alert. He nodded to the guard and stepped in through the side door. Inside, it was warm. Lived in. Posters on the wall. A corkboard covered with flyers for GED programs, job fairs, recovery meetings. He passed through the kitchen, past volunteers preparing basic meals. He didn't stop. He made his way to the office in the back. Unlocked the drawer. Pulled out a list. Reviewed every name who hadn't checked in yet. Then he added a new line to the sheet. A one-time fund. Everyone who checked in that night would get a fresh meal the next day. Not just soup. Something real. Something hot. He made a note, folded the paper, and slid it into the folder on the desk. Then he left unnoticed. By the time he returned to his corner of the city, the lights in the expensive restaurant were still glowing. He passed by without pausing. The waiter was gone. A different server now stood at the host station, eyes forward, shoulders straighter. The next morning, an article appeared online. A restaurant downtown had been the subject of a mysterious act of generosity. The bill, estimated at over $6,000, had been paid in full by an anonymous man. Witnesses said he didn't eat, that he left without saying a word, that he had been insulted earlier in the day. Some commenters called it a stunt. Some said it was a statement. Most didn't believe it. But one woman, a server who hadn't been on shift that day, reposted the article with a simple caption. He used to eat here with his mother. Before he lost her. Before they lost everything. It didn't go viral, but it reached who it needed to. And in the back of the city, in a room with no bed, he read the post and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to remember. He hadn't come for revenge. He had come for silence. To see how the world responded to someone without armor, without announcements, without warning. And in the silence that followed, he found exactly what he was looking for. The city changed its tempo after dark. Daylight's rhythm, quick, noisy, expectant, gave way to a slower, breathier hum. Cars still moved, people still rushed, but the urgency dulled. Streetlights pooled soft gold across wet sidewalks, neon signs flickered half-heartedly above diners and drugstores. And through it all, he walked, steady, silent, wrapped in layers of fabric worn not for fashion, but for endurance. He turned down a narrow alley 2 blocks from the financial district. No signs, no lights, just a heavy steel door behind a bakery that closed at 5. He knocked once. A bolt slid open, and a woman with tired eyes greeted him with nothing more than a nod. Inside was a community space. No name. No brand. Just concrete walls, folding tables, and the smell of cheap coffee. Volunteers cleaned the floor. Someone sorted coats by size into a pile near the corner. He dropped his backpack behind a stack of boxes, rolled up his sleeves, and joined the assembly line. For the next 3 hours, he said nothing. He packed canned goods into paper bags, checked expiration dates, lifted crates. His mind didn't wander. He liked it here. No one asked where he came from. No one cared that his watch was worth more than most people's rent. In this room, value wasn't measured by noise or net worth or posture. When they finished, he took a bag and left it at the base of a rusted fire escape 2 blocks east. A woman lived there sometimes. She didn't trust shelters, but she took food. He never saw her face, just her shadow. That was enough. On his way back through the center of the city, he passed the restaurant again. The front was still glowing, lights warm behind the glass. The tables were full. Laughter slipped through the walls like perfume. But the mood was different now. The weight of yesterday lingered in the air like smoke. The server who had dismissed him was gone. A new one had taken his place, younger, softer, eyes more careful. He paused outside for a moment. Inside, a family sat near the window. A boy no older than 10 reached for a piece of bread with small, eager hands. His parents were distracted, talking to each other. The boy caught the man's gaze through the glass and smiled without hesitation. The man nodded back, then kept walking. He didn't need to be seen. Not anymore. The following morning, headlines shifted. Another news site picked up the story. This time, with a blurry security footage of a man in a hoodie stepping through the restaurant's front doors. The story repeated itself. A stranger had paid for everyone's meal. No one knew who he was. No one knew why. Speculation ignited in the comments. A millionaire in disguise. A viral marketing stunt. A guilt-ridden ex-employee. A ghost. But no one mentioned his name. Because no one knew it. And that was how he wanted it. While they debated, he sat in the back of a public library 2 neighborhoods away. The computers were free. He opened one, pulled up the financial dashboard of his foundation, and began approving grants. A youth center needed funding for after-school meals. A single mother was waiting on a housing deposit. A scholarship for a student whose father had died last winter waited for a signature. He clicked. Approved. Clicked again. Approved. There was no ceremony. No fanfare. Just numbers shifting on screens. At lunch, he left the library and bought a sandwich. Sat on a bench near a playground and watched children chase each other around rusted swings. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember when he was one of them. Back when life hadn't yet folded him inward. Back when food was love. Back when his mother would spend her last dollar to keep him full and warm. She had taught him something he could never forget. You don't have to be seen to make a difference. You just have to show up. And he had. Again. And again. And again. The days blurred into one another after that, each unfolding like the last, quietly, purposefully, without applause. He kept to the same rhythm, morning walks across the city, unmarked stops at food banks, backdoor visits to shelters, silent donations left in mail slots or undermats. He never waited to see who found them. The act was never about recognition. It was about balance. He had been given too little for too long. Now that he had more than he needed, he knew where it belonged. One evening, a storm rolled through, heavy with wind and soaked in the smell of iron. Rain slicked the streets until they gleamed. He moved through it slowly, head down, hood up, hands deep in his coat pockets. At the corner of 7th and Glen, the lights of the restaurant cut through the downpour like a lighthouse. He didn't plan to stop, but his feet slowed. Inside, the place buzzed. Tables full. Candles lit. The sound of forks against porcelain. But he wasn't watching the diners. He was watching a boy near the kitchen entrance, maybe 16, maybe 17, hair pulled into braids, shirt too big, shoulders squared like someone who had something to prove. A new hire. Probably bussing dishes. The boy moved quickly, hands shaking slightly as he tried to balance glasses on a tray. A woman at table 6 waved him over, pointed at a spot on the floor, her expression sharp. The boy knelt, wiped it clean, stood again. The server beside her rolled her eyes and smirked behind his back. He saw himself in the boy. Not in the work. In the way he bore it. Quiet. Careful. Trying not to break anything, not plates, not the silence, not himself. He crossed the street and disappeared down the side alley that ran behind the restaurant. The back door was propped open slightly for ventilation. The kitchen was a bustle of noise and light and heat. He stayed in the shadows, just watching. At the end of the night, when the lights dimmed and chairs flipped onto tables, he returned. This time through the front. A few staff remained, cleaning surfaces, mopping floors. The general manager looked up and stiffened when he saw the man. Recognized him. Nodded, unsure of what to say. The man raised a hand slightly, enough to stop the apology before it began. He asked about the boy. Quietly. The manager gestured toward the back. The man waited. When the boy stepped out, still in his apron, sweat on his brow, he looked startled. Like maybe he'd done something wrong. The man said nothing. Just reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Thick. Sealed. No markings. He handed it to the boy, who hesitated before taking it. He opened it slowly. Inside, cash. Enough to breathe. Enough to change things. The boy looked up, eyes wide. But the man was already gone, swallowed by the rain outside. Later that night, while sitting on the roof of a building he sometimes slept atop, an old apartment complex with a flat top and a decent view, he stared at the skyline. The city glowed like a machine, unaware of the gears that kept it running. He didn't envy those inside the light anymore. He had walked among them, heard their voices, watched them flinch at what they didn't understand. What they called charity, he called responsibility. What they called extraordinary, he called overdue. And yet, the city still asked the wrong questions. Who was he? Why did he do it? What was his motive? They never asked the question that mattered. What had they done to let a man like him go unseen for so long? The next morning, he awoke to the sound of pigeons above him and horns below. He stretched, cold but whole, and stood. He checked his phone, not for messages, but for the next list. The next grant. The next balance to be restored. He was just one man, but he carried thousands of meals in his silence. Rain turned to frost as the season shifted, painting corners of windows in pale white as heaters began to hum in apartment blocks and coffee shops filled with heavier coats. The city adjusted its shape slowly, but he did not. His coat remained the same. His shoes still whispered against the sidewalk. His path through the world, quiet as always, remained invisible to those who weren't looking for him. But people had started to wonder. The restaurant had changed since that day. Not the decor, the glass still shimmered, the cutlery still caught candlelight like teeth. But the energy. Staff whispered about him. They didn't know his name, but they knew he existed. They didn't speak of him with disdain. They used words like gentle, like strange, like real. Some said he had been rich once. Others claimed he was testing them. The truth was smaller than their legends and far more human. He had lived in the alley behind that building for nearly 4 months before he ever walked through its front door. That fact was never printed. That story was never asked. He had given away more than the restaurant had earned that month, and yet he never once stepped inside to eat. He didn't want their food. He wanted their attention. Not on him, but on each other. On the cracks. On the dismissals. On the cruelty that passes for routine. Word had spread. Quietly. Other restaurants began to act differently. A cafe down the street started offering 1 free meal a day, no questions asked. A bakery he had once left an envelope in started a pay-it-forward wall where strangers could cover future meals. People didn't know why they were doing it, only that it felt like the right thing to do. He noticed but never claimed. The city began to carry his fingerprints, but it would never know his name. One afternoon, he stood in line outside a food truck in the warehouse district. The man ahead of him looked familiar. A face from a boardroom, maybe. A former executive. Clean coat, designer boots. He glanced over his shoulder, paused at the sight of the man behind him. Recognition flickered. Shame followed. The man looked down, turned away, said nothing. But he paid for 2 meals. No words. No eye contact. Just a quiet transaction that meant more than it should. The man took the meal and ate it on a bench overlooking the river. The wind cut across the water, sharp but bearable. He chewed slowly, deliberately, as he always did. Around him, people passed, some with strollers, some on phones, some shouting into traffic. No one noticed him. And yet, their lives were touching the edges of his. He returned to the youth shelter that evening, where an older teen sat curled near the radiator, sketching in a journal. He watched from a distance, then approached with a gentle step, placing a box of markers beside the boy before turning away. No speech. No instruction. Just a gift. The boy didn't look up, but he smiled. On his walk back through the city, he passed a diner with a sign in the window. If you're hungry, we'll feed you. No questions. No judgment. He stopped, stared at it, then walked on. He didn't need a meal. He had already eaten. And what filled him now had no calories, no cost, no expiration date. It was something else. Something rarer. A life that wasn't owed. A presence that asked for nothing. And gave everything. Morning arrived as a soft gray veil across the city, mist collecting on glass awnings, turning the skyline into a watercolor of shadows and light. He stood at a street corner with a paper cup in his hands, not for coins, not for begging, but for warmth. Steam rose faintly from it. The coffee inside wasn't good, but it was hot, and today that was enough. He watched people pass, their faces buried in scarves, their ears plugged with headphones. No one noticed him. That was how it had always been. But something had changed beneath the surface. Not the way people looked at him, most still didn't, but the way the city behaved. There were cracks now where kindness bloomed. Places where meals waited without price tags. Places where judgment paused before forming. He hadn't expected a ripple. He hadn't expected anything at all. But the city, like any living thing, had its memory. And the man with the black card who never asked for thanks had become a rumor, one that haunted cash registers and coat closets. One that whispered through alleyways and break rooms. He crossed the street and entered a library. He had no address, but he had a login. The librarian nodded at him. She didn't know his story, but she knew he never stayed long and that he always returned the chair where he found it. He sat at a computer and opened the dashboard again. His foundation's requests had doubled. Tripled. There were letters now, hand-scanned, some typed, most not. From veterans. From single parents. From students. From people he had never met but somehow knew. He read every one. And then he started approving them. No speeches. No press releases. Just money moving where it was most needed. He believed in systems that worked silently. In justice that didn't announce itself. At noon, he left the library and took a train to the outskirts of the city to a school he had quietly helped restore after its art program was defunded. The principal greeted him without ceremony. She knew who he was even if no one else did. In her office, a wall was now covered with drawings made by children, towers of color, portraits of imaginary worlds, paper dreams pinned in rows. She said thank you. He nodded. That was all. Later that night, he walked past the same restaurant where it had all started. It had changed. The same white linen, the same glass walls, but now there was a small plaque near the entrance. Not on the main door. Just beside the planter, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. It read, "For those we overlook. For those who remember." He didn't stop. He didn't need to. He crossed the street and sat on a bench near the square. From his pocket, he pulled a small notepad and pencil. He wrote a name. Then another. A list of people he had met. Not many. Just a handful. Those he'd helped directly. Those who reminded him why it mattered. He folded the paper and placed it in his coat. The city was quieter at this hour. The lights warmer. The cold less biting. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment and smiled. Not because he had fixed anything, but because he hadn't looked away. Because when they told him this food wasn't for beggars, he had given it anyway. Because dignity, like hunger, asks nothing more than to be acknowledged. And because generosity doesn't need to be seen to be real. It just needs to be done.